The northern countryside of France had gone silent by the end of November 1944. Smoke still rose from distant barn roofs, and the ground remained littered with the debris of retreating troops. On the outskirts of a shelled village stood a worn stone estate, once grand, now reduced to a hollow relic of nobility. Tall iron gates, twisted and rusted, framed the entrance, and behind them lay a world the locals refused to speak about. It had no name on maps and no mention in orders, yet its presence weighed heavily on everyone who passed nearby. Inside the estate's crumbling walls, the rooms were dark and cold. Thin curtains blocked the windows, and the interior smelled of mildew, iodine, and despair. In the former servants' quarters, women huddled in silence, their backs against walls marked with scratches and old blood. They slept in narrow cots, often two to a bed, wrapped in coarse blankets that did little to keep the cold at bay. Conversation was rare and whispered. Laughter had vanished long ago. The women were French. Some came from cities like Paris or Lyon, others from remote villages in Normandy or Alsace. They had been taken at different times and in different ways, arrested for minor infractions, caught up in raids, or simply selected during moral inspections by SS officers seeking to supply their unofficial garrison brothel. The estate had been repurposed into a comfort station for German troops, one kept secret from the public and disguised behind bureaucratic euphemisms. Most women were between 17 and 30, though a few were older. Some had children, some had never kissed a man willingly. They were stripped of their clothes, documents, and names upon arrival. In their place, they were assigned numbers and work shifts. Guards referred to them as units, not people. Each morning began with a health inspection, and each evening ended in exhaustion, bleeding, or numbness. The passage of time was measured only by the number of men who visited each cell. There were no windows in the lower levels of the estate, only vents and cracks where winter air seeped through. Rats moved freely in the kitchens, and mold crept up the edges of the wallpaper. Despite the filth, there was order. Charts pinned to walls, rotation schedules updated with red pencil, records of which women had been used and how often. Efficiency, the Germans called it, sanitation through cruelty. The women had long since learned the rules of survival. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't cry where they can hear you. Don't fight unless you're ready to die. Some complied out of fear, others out of a sheer instinct to stay alive. They had created a code of quiet resistance, glances, finger taps, shared crusts of bread. In the shadows, they formed their own kind of sisterhood. Outside, the war had shifted. The Allies had broken through German lines. But inside the estate, the women knew nothing. Rumors slipped in occasionally. Whispers from injured soldiers, dropped newspapers, a mention of Paris, but they dared not believe. Hope was dangerous. It made people reckless, and recklessness here led to punishment. Punishment was swift and public. A woman who attempted escape was beaten and locked in a root cellar for 5 days. Another who spat at an officer was shot in front of the others. They made her kneel first. Afterward, they made the other women clean the floor. The message was clear: you belong to us. And yet, despite everything, they endured. They endured because they had no choice. Because deep down, a thread of self still remained, tangled beneath bruises and silence. Some dreamed of returning home. Others only dreamed of sleeping without fear. In the quietest hours of the night, just before dawn, they sometimes whispered names of mothers, of children, of themselves, before they were numbers. The estate became their prison and their graveyard. Yet within its walls, something human persisted, something that even the cruelty of war had not erased. It was not hope, not yet, but it was the memory of what it meant to be more than a function, and that memory refused to die. The use of French women in clandestine military brothels was never publicly acknowledged during the occupation. Officially, the German military maintained a stance of order and discipline. Behind closed doors, however, select officers organized hidden stations to maintain morale and control the behavior of soldiers without allowing racial or ideological contamination. These places were kept out of records, managed by trusted SS units, and protected by threats and silence. The estate outside Metz was one of these stations, carefully removed from scrutiny but fully operational. Recruitment was often a euphemism for abduction. Some women were taken during house raids, accused of harboring resistance members or Jewish families. Others were detained for infractions as small as curfew violations or lacking proper papers. Once selected, they were transferred at night, blindfolded or gagged to ensure they couldn't remember the route. Arrival meant disorientation, humiliation, and permanent separation from their past lives. Their families were never notified. Upon entry, the women were stripped and examined by a military doctor. The process was brutal and dehumanizing. Physical health was not assessed for the woman's well-being, but for her ability to endure repeated sexual use. Those deemed too thin, too sick, or too old were either redirected to labor camps or quietly eliminated. Those who passed were cataloged, photographed, and assigned numbers. Their names were erased on the first day. Life in the estate followed a strict regimen. Wake-ups occurred before dawn. Inspections were conducted at regular intervals. Each woman had an assigned schedule based on perceived compliance and physical condition. Punishments were built into the routine: denial of food, confinement, beatings. There was no escape from the monotony of violation. Even silence became enforced. Speaking out of turn was met with violence. The guards operated with cold detachment. Most were German nationals trained for camp discipline, but some were French collaborators who had switched allegiances for privilege or safety. These men were often the most brutal, using their familiarity with the language to mock or manipulate the women. Orders came in clipped, impersonal tones. Resistance was not tolerated. Submission was expected, praised, and recorded. Medical procedures became instruments of fear. Weekly examinations included invasive checks for infection, bruising, or pregnancy. Abortions were carried out without anesthesia. Contraceptives were rarely provided. The doctor, dressed in immaculate uniform, treated the women like livestock, tagged, inspected, and reprocessed. Some began to feign illness in hopes of being deemed unusable. But if suspicions arose, the consequences were fatal. Psychological manipulation was as sharp as the physical harm. The women were told repeatedly that no one would come for them, that they were forgotten, that even if they escaped, they would be shunned for what they had become. These words sank deep over time. Some women began to believe it. Others simply stopped thinking about anything beyond survival. Within the walls of the estate, time fractured. There were no calendars, no clocks, only routine. Morning became indistinguishable from night. The days bled into one another, and the women learned to exist in stillness. Some clung to rituals, folding their blanket the same way each morning, touching a wall before sleeping. These small acts were the last expressions of autonomy they had left. Yet, despite the system's design, humanity persisted. Women helped each other endure in subtle ways. A hand squeezed in secret, a gesture of warning when a guard was approaching. They shared scraps of soap, bits of cloth, even pieces of memory. These acts, though small, formed a resistance that could not be measured in violence or rebellion. It was the refusal to let the system erase them completely. They began to develop a language without words. A cough might mean danger. A footstep held in place might signal refusal. One woman taught others to count using their knuckles, just to remember how many days had passed. Memory became their currency. It was the only thing that still belonged to them. By the end of 1944, the estate held over 24 women. Many had forgotten their own faces. Others had stopped speaking altogether. But in the quiet, in the darkness, in the long corridors where soldiers walked and doors slammed shut, a thin strand of resistance held. Not a plan, not an escape, just the will to survive one more day, and then another. The first sign of change wasn't sound, it was stillness. For months, the estate had been a place of constant noise, barking orders, slammed doors, heavy boots pacing the halls. But one morning, just before dawn, the air shifted. There were no patrols, no shouted commands, only an uneasy silence that pressed against the walls like fog. The women noticed it immediately. Silence here was never good. Then came the sound of engines in the distance, lower pitched than the German trucks they had learned to recognize. Gunfire followed, short and scattered, then stopped. No one spoke. The women remained in their beds, frozen in place, too afraid to speculate. They had heard rumors before, of Allied advances, of Paris freed, of American troops moving north. But rumors didn't unlock doors, and hope was too dangerous to entertain. Around midday, the first unfamiliar footsteps echoed through the compound, slower, heavier, and without the clipped rhythm of German boots. The doors didn't slam. Instead, hinges creaked open cautiously, as if whoever entered didn't want to frighten anyone. Then a voice, low, firm, but not angry, called something in English. The women couldn't understand the words, but the tone wasn't threatening. It sounded like someone asking a question, not issuing an order. In one of the basement rooms, a soldier stepped into the threshold and stopped. He didn't move forward. He looked directly at the woman sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and said nothing. Then, slowly, he knelt and placed a blanket on the ground. A flask of water followed. He backed out without another word. The woman didn't touch either item. Not yet. More soldiers arrived, moving cautiously from room to room. They held their weapons low but ready. Some spoke in short, hushed sentences. When they saw the women, they froze, not in fear, but in confusion. These weren't enemy combatants. They were civilians, emaciated, bruised, silent. Their presence didn't make sense to the soldiers. No one had told them to expect this. No one had told them to expect this. One of the soldiers removed his helmet and whispered something to his comrade. Another covered his mouth, visibly shaken. They weren't prepared for what they had found. These weren't prisoners of war. These were women who had been hidden, used, and forgotten. Some soldiers tried to speak to them in broken French, but the women flinched at every sound. It became clear that something was deeply wrong. No woman cried out for help. No one rushed forward. They simply waited, still, as if punishment would follow kindness. One woman recoiled when a soldier extended his hand. Another began to shake uncontrollably when someone opened a window. The light itself was too sudden. It had been months since sunlight touched their skin. Medical officers were summoned. A female nurse entered one of the rooms and found 3 women pressed into a corner. She tried to smile, to offer reassurance, but they didn't move. She left bandages and antiseptic on a chair, hoping they would approach once she was gone. In another room, a soldier removed his boots before entering, unsure why, but feeling it was right. It took hours before anyone dared to touch the water left for them. When one woman finally reached for it, her hands trembled so violently that she spilled most of it. Another woman helped her, silently steadying the flask. No words were spoken. But in that moment, something shifted. A line was crossed, not from fear to trust, but from paralysis to motion. And that was enough. The estate was secured by nightfall. No German soldiers remained. In the official report, it was listed as a cleared residence with civilian presence. But for the women inside, it was the first night in years they weren't under orders. They didn't sleep. Most sat awake, staring at walls that no longer locked them in. Still, they didn't believe it. Not yet. Freedom had arrived, but it did not feel like rescue. It felt like confusion, like a break in rhythm too sudden to accept. They had survived too long in darkness to understand light. The footsteps beyond the wall had changed, but it would take much more to convince them that they no longer had to hide. The American medical team set up a temporary station in the village schoolhouse just beyond the estate walls. It had once been a place for children, filled with chalkboards and desks, but now it housed cots, blankets, and triage tables. The women were brought in small groups, carried or guided by soldiers who still spoke too loudly, moved too quickly. Every step outside the estate was terrifying. The open air felt exposed, the sunlight foreign. Most women kept their heads down, shielding their eyes, as if waiting for a blow. Nurses tried to explain what was happening. Through translators and gestures, they reassured the women that they were safe, that no one would hurt them, that the doctors were there to help. But kindness did not translate. When the first examination began, the woman screamed, not from pain, but from expectation. The presence of gloves, medical lights, and uniforms triggered panic. To them, these settings had always been preludes to punishment. After several failed attempts, the staff changed their approach. One nurse, Clara Reynolds, began leaving soap, water, and fresh towels inside the rooms without saying anything. Then she stepped outside, closed the door, and waited. Hours passed before anyone touched the basin. But eventually, one woman, thin, trembling, barefoot, stepped forward and washed her hands. It was the first time in years she had done so without surveillance. Another woman followed, and then another. The act of bathing in privacy, of removing dirt and blood without being watched, was transformative. One woman collapsed after washing, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming sensation of reclaiming her own skin. They cried silently, the water becoming cloudy with ash and memory. Nothing about it was glamorous. It was survival, finally allowed to breathe. When the women were given clean clothes, some hesitated to put them on. They clutched the fabric as if it might vanish. Others folded it neatly and placed it beside them, unsure if it truly belonged to them. Identity had been stripped so many times, the idea of ownership, of anything, felt foreign. A few refused the clothing altogether, certain it was a trick. It would take time. One woman whispered her real name to a nurse. The nurse wrote it down phonetically and repeated it back, softly. The woman nodded. That became a new practice, writing down names, folding the papers into small cards, pinning them to coats. The names were often incomplete, missing surnames or exact spellings, but they mattered. For the first time, someone acknowledged who they had been before the walls. As their bodies began to recover, fragments of their personalities re-emerged. A young woman from Bordeaux began humming lullabies to herself. An older woman who had once been a teacher sat with a pencil and scribbled letters she could still remember. Another asked for a comb and spent nearly an hour untangling another woman's hair. These were not acts of vanity. They were quiet declarations. I am still here. The nurses noticed patterns of caretaking. Some women, despite their trauma, began comforting others, adjusting blankets, holding hands during checkups, whispering soft encouragements. The Americans had expected victims too broken to speak, What they witnessed instead was resilience wrapped in silence. These women had not simply endured, they had carried each other through the darkest hours. Psychological recovery was slower. Many women flinched at sudden movement or loud voices. Doors still triggered anxiety. Touch, even gentle, had to be offered with warning. Sleep was interrupted by cries, by tremors, by a fear that the soldiers would return. The staff began assigning female guards to the night shifts. It helped, but nightmares persisted. Still, every day brought a small sign of healing. A request for more food, a question about the weather, a laugh, sharp, short, but unmistakable, when one woman tried to mimic an American nurse's clumsy French. These were not grand milestones, but they were real. In the space between fear and safety, the women were slowly stitching themselves back together. They would never be who they were before. Too much had been taken. But in this new space, one where no one yelled, where no one counted them as inventory, they began to relearn something close to peace. The body, once a site of violence, was returning to them inch by inch, and with it the quiet beginnings of trust. Freedom, once attained, did not come with clarity. For many of the women, it felt like being dropped into unfamiliar territory with no map and no destination. They had been prisoners for so long that captivity had become a kind of structure. Now, with the doors open and guards gone, they faced the terrifying weight of choice. What to do? Where to go? Who to be? These questions had no simple answers. Some of the women expressed a desire to return home, but home was not always there. Letters sent to villages in Normandy or the outskirts of Paris were returned unanswered or marked with the word disparu. Families had moved, died, or closed their doors out of shame. Others feared returning to places where their names were remembered, not with warmth, but with whispers. In conservative towns, survival was not always seen as triumph. For many, it was seen as stain. A few women remained near the American field hospital, helping with translation or organizing supplies. They didn't speak of what had happened, but found comfort in routine. One, a former librarian, began alphabetizing the Red Cross medical files. Another tended to the camp garden, planting late winter vegetables with silent determination. It was their way of reclaiming space, of grounding themselves in something that didn't revolve around pain. Some chose to disappear entirely. New names were adopted. Backgrounds were fabricated. They moved to other cities, other countries, Belgium, Switzerland, Canada, where no one knew them. Starting over was a form of freedom, even if it meant burying the truth. One woman married a German deserter and opened a bakery in Marseille. No one ever guessed what she had endured. She never told. There were those who, in time, began to speak. In the 1990s, when international discussions around wartime sexual violence grew louder, a small group of survivors came forward. They told their stories in courtrooms, at human rights forums, in interviews with journalists. It was not for pity, but for record. Their testimony forced governments to acknowledge what had long been buried. Their voices gave shape to a history once denied. But most women remained silent, not out of shame, but out of choice. They had rebuilt fragile lives, homes, families, identities, and speaking risked unraveling all of it. For them, healing was quiet. It was in the scent of soap, in the rhythm of sewing, in the ability to sleep through a thunderstorm without flinching. Not all wounds needed to be shared to be survived. Some American and French aid organizations offered limited assistance. Some survivors were given temporary housing or vocational training, but resources were stretched thin. War left few heroes and even fewer guarantees. Paperwork was lost, identities blurred, and many women were never officially acknowledged by either government. It was easier, some believed, to forget them, to pretend they had never been taken. In this void of recognition, The women turned to each other. Small support groups formed in Paris and Lyon, informal, unadvertised, deeply private. They drank tea. They read poetry. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Just being in a room with others who understood was enough. A kind of sanctuary born not of religion or politics, but of shared survival. One woman, Colette, wrote in her journal that the hardest part was not the memory, but the silence of others. "I survived a war I was never in," she wrote. "No medals, no graves, just rooms with locked doors." Her words were later quoted in a university thesis on gendered trauma. Her name remained unknown, but her voice endured. Liberation did not erase what had happened. It did not fix what had been broken. But it did offer a new kind of space, a world where decisions could be made without threat, where meals didn't come with conditions, where mourning didn't begin with inspections. In that space, the women shaped lives that belonged to them. And that, after everything, was victory enough. Decades passed, but the memory of what happened behind the estate's stone walls never truly disappeared. For many of the women, the trauma faded into the background of daily life, but it never left entirely. It surfaced in moments of silence, in dreams they couldn't control, in the sound of boots on concrete or the sight of uniforms. Some lived full lives, raising children, running businesses, growing old with dignity. But the past was always nearby, like a shadow just outside the frame. It shaped them in quiet ways, influencing how they touched others, how they moved through the world, how they endured pain. In the early 2000s, a memorial was erected outside Metz, not grand or ceremonial, but intimate. A single bronze chair, empty, beside a plaque that read, "To those who were taken without being asked, to those who survived without being thanked." It was not funded by the state, but by a collective of historians and descendants who had unearthed records, testimonies, and photographs hidden for decades. Survivors were invited to the unveiling, though most chose not to attend. Some sent letters. One sent a pressed violet between two pages with a note, "Thank you for remembering what we couldn't say." Historians began to revisit the occupation years with renewed focus on gendered violence. Testimonies from former comfort women in Asia helped open space for European voices long silenced. A French journalist uncovered diary entries belonging to a nurse stationed near the estate in 1944. Her records, detailed, precise, full of heartbreak, became the backbone of a new documentary that aired on national television. It was the first time many in France heard the term military brothel used in reference to their own history. The documentary stirred controversy. Some called it exaggerated, others denied it outright. But among those who knew the truth, those who had lived it or carried its echoes, the airing was both painful and validating. Survivors didn't seek revenge. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted their suffering to be named, not erased. For every woman who chose to speak, there were others who remained silent. And that silence, too, became part of the record. Not as absence, but as resistance. The refusal to relive what was taken from them became its own form of strength. Their lives were not defined by victimhood. They were shaped by endurance. Some grandchildren only learned the truth after their grandmothers died. They found letters tucked into coat linings, worn notebooks hidden in sewing kits, or photos with names carefully crossed out. These discoveries did not bring closure. They brought awe and grief and a deeper respect for the women who had carried so much without complaint. One granddaughter wrote in a school essay, "My grandmother survived a war I was never taught about, but now I carry it for her." Institutions eventually responded. Educational programs were updated. Museums added new exhibits. Survivors' testimonies were translated into multiple languages and archived digitally. But these gestures, while important, always felt late. Recognition after silence is better than none at all, but it cannot restore what was lost. In the final years of their lives, many survivors found quiet moments of peace. Some returned to places they had once feared. Others visited the memorial in Metz, placing wildflowers beneath the chair without speaking. A few left no trace at all, only the memory carried by those they touched. And in that memory, their truth remained alive. The legacy of these women is not only one of suffering, it is one of persistence, of refusing to vanish, of surviving in defiance of a system built to erase them. Their strength was not loud. It did not come with parades or medals. It lived in the decision to keep going, to wake up, to breathe, to love again, even quietly. What happened in that hidden estate outside Metz can never be undone. But because they lived, because they endured, the world was forced to remember. And in that remembering, there is power. Not the kind found in armies or governments, but in voices once silenced, now echoing across generations.